All right, so the director of the CDC, Dr. Walensky, came out the other day. This was a few days ago, 3 or 4 days ago now, and she stated, I believe this is actually on Fox News, that over 75% of COVID deaths, she was specifically talking the vaccinated here about, I'll talk about that here in a second, that 75% of COVID deaths in the vaccinated had at least four comorbidities. Now, people are going off and asking like this is some sort of, or acting like it's some sort of shocking revelation. If you've been at all paying attention and looking at the research and the data on this thing, and not just sitting on your couch drooling over yourself in fear watching CNN, this evidence was made clear long ago. Like, I mean, early 2020, if not, or at least mid 2020. We knew that the overwhelming majority of people who die of COVID 19 or supposedly die of COVID 19 have multiple comorbidities. Now, again, she mentioned specifically that the 75% figure is in the vaccinated. However, these numbers are exactly the same for vaccinated, unvaccinated. It doesn't matter because, again, back in early to mid 2020, it was made clear that the overwhelming majority of people who died of COVID or supposedly died of COVID had multiple comorbidities. Now, a lot of people don't understand what a comorbidity is. A comorbidity is a disease, illness, or condition that in of itself can lead to death. So that's why it's called a comorbidity, morbidity being a medical term for death, right? So, and she said that over 75%, which the evidence does support this and has supported this for a very long time, of COVID deaths had at least four comorbidities. So that means over 75% of the people who died of COVID, or supposedly died of COVID, had at least four conditions that in of themselves could lead to death. So someone with four comorbidities would be somebody who has, I'll just make up an example here, somebody who is, let's say, is type 2 diabetes, has chronic heart failure or heart disease, has severe hypertension, and is also struggling with pneumonia, right? So that would be somebody with four comorbidities. All of those individually can potentially lead to that person's death. So that'd be someone with four comorbidities. So, someone who has four comorbidities, I mean, they are severely ill. They are literally and many times figuratively on their deathbeds. I mean, they are very, very ill. Their life expectancy is nil at best because they have a lot of things that are actively trying to kill that individual. Just the way it is. That person is extremely, extremely ill to begin with. And if they catch COVID, well, that just might be the thing that kind of finally kicks them off the edge. So again, over 75% of these COVID deaths had at least four comorbidities. Four, again, is a lot. Now, how many of those had only three, two, or even just a single comorbidity? We can ask these questions, but we already have evidence to suggest what those numbers are. Italy just did a study where they didn't take all the deaths of all their supposed COVID deaths. They took a few thousand of them. They basically did a study to see how many of those people had comorbidities of those a few thousand people who supposedly died of COVID. How many of them actually? How many of them had a comorbidity or multiple comorbidities? And it turns out that only less than 3%. I believe the exact number was 2.7% of those supposed COVID deaths of the few thousand that they researched or studied. Only 2.7% of them had no morbidities, or pre-existing conditions. So they were, at least on the surface level, healthy. They had no known pre-existing conditions or comorbidities, and really the only thing that you could say caused their death was COVID. Outside of that, everyone else had at least one comorbidity, and the majority of them probably had, again, if the numbers are probably similar to what they are in the United States and around the world, the vast majority of them probably had three or four or even more comorbidities. Question has to be asked here, and she was asked about this, by the way. I believe, again, this was Fox News to where this kind of information came out, where she admitted this. is how many of these people died of COVID rather than from, or died of COVID rather than with COVID, right? Because if you have someone who has, in this example, 4 comorbidities, again, like I've said in the beginning of this video, these things can individually can cause their death. So how many of these people actually died of COVID and not of whatever other comorbidities they had? Because if you have chronic heart failure, let's just say, and you have a heart attack and you're driven to the hospital and you unfortunately die of of a heart attack because you've been struggling with chronic heart failure for, let's say, 2 years, but you happen to test positive for COVID when you got to the hospital or post death, the CDC has admitted this too, they count that as a COVID death. But he obviously, anyone who has 2 brain cells or together knows that he didn't die of COVID, or he died of his chronic heart failure and a heart attack. So out of all these people who, again, there's like something like 830-something thousand people who have currently supposedly died of COVID in the United States, how many of those people actually died of COVID and not from the other multitude of comorbidities that the majority of the people who, again, supposedly died of COVID, how many of those people actually died of COVID and not just with COVID, which again is 2 very different things. So that's the big question to ask here. Another big question to ask is, was all this worth it? I mean, obviously, you probably can assume my answer to this, but, was it worth it? Was the economic, social implications and problems associated with, mass masking, lockdowns, all the lockdowns that are currently happening, all these ridiculous vaccine mandates, is it really worth it for a disease, a condition, an illness that virtually only kills people who are very ill, right? Yes, there are always going to be outliers of people who are going to be, fairly healthy, at least on the surface, and they're going to die from it. But, that happened with the flu. That happens with virtually everything, that any disease that can, potentially kill you. But the overwhelming majority of people, 95%, if you will, of people who died of COVID or supposedly died of COVID had at least one comorbidity. And majority of them had multiple comorbidities. So was it all worth it? And that's really the big question to be asked. And is it still worth it? Because all these lockdowns are still going down. The vaccine mandates are going crazy and all of that. And these people are still acting absolutely crazy, living in fear. And the fear mongering and the fear porn is still in high gear. Is it all worth it for something that virtually only kills the very ill? Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, informative, and entertaining. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow depending on where you're watching this. You can follow me on Instagram at Tyler_MidgardStrength, and I am also on Zion. My 2 community pages are Midgard Strength and Conditioning and Gungnir Strategic. You can scan their respective codes here or search for them on the community search page. If you like my strength and conditioning content, check out my podcast, the Classical Strength Podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. Finally, if you would like to become stronger and healthier than you've ever been in your life, consider hiring me as your coach. I offer the most effective and personalized online coaching in the industry. So if that's something that would interest you, visit my website, midgardstrength.com, or you can email me directly at tyler@midgardstrength.com. Thanks for watching.